Hey everyone, my name is Kenzie Dodds and I am joined by my friend Tanner Lindsley. We've been buddies for several years now, and actually Tanner was on Chats with Kent podcast, so if you've listened to that, we have already talked about React Query on there. Yeah, I'm excited to chat with Tanner about React Query and the other stuff that he is involved with. We also are using his library React Virtual in the performance workshop. So yeah, just excited to have Tanner here. Tanner, could you I kind of introed a couple of the things that you work on, but can you tell us anything else about yourself that you want us to know?
Yeah, well, happy to be here. I have a startup I'm constantly working on called Nozzle. Uh, as Kent already described, I've got like a really weird obsession with building open source software, and I obviously love React, all things React, and yeah, not much else to know.
Cool, cool. Yeah, we got to know each other back in the AngularJS days when we were all over AngularJS, and I don't know which one of us moved first. I think you may have moved to React first. I can't remember. Was it I moved at the end of 2015.
Um, I moved in 2015 as well, early 2015.
Yeah.
So, but I
So
think you
yeah,
were playing around with it before me though,
that's
because
yeah.
I remember a lightning talk at one of the meetups locally here where you're like, I tried out this React thing and it was really fast. And I was like, whoa.
Yeah.
I was like,
Yes.
Kent, what are you doing?
Changed everything, man. Yeah, it was great. So yeah, but you've been busy like for years actually. You've been building open source libraries, and recently you've been doing lots of hooks related stuff. You've got a really great talk. What was that talk called? It was at the Hawaii JS, right?
Yeah, that one is React Hooks, the ultimate abstraction layer.
Yeah, that
I think that's what it was called.
great talk. I everybody should go look that talk up. It's a great talk. And you've been just hammering out some really awesome libraries on that, based on React hooks. Do you want to tell us about some of those things?
Yeah, so the first one that I built was called React Table, and that was actually before Hooks even came out. And when Hooks came out, it was the first one that I was like, I got to refactor everything to go to React Hooks. So there's React Table, which used to be a component library, like you drop in an actual table component, but now it's just a hook and it's headless. So you kind of render your own table markup using React Table as like a utility. It's really cool.
Yeah, it's wild. So like, are you using, I haven't used React Table, but I'm assuming that you're using things like prop getters and things to get props across the elements that people are rendering?
Yeah, prop getters. Don't coin the term, Kent, but that's exactly what they are. Is I call them prop getters in the docs and everything. Yeah, so like using prop getters and there's a lot of like plugin-esque reducers everywhere that you can kind of customize the props for everything, and yeah.
Very cool. Yeah, that's the idea of headless UI components was predated React hooks, and you were using render props before, or you said it was actual component that you used, or what was it?
So before, you would actually render a component, and then to override any of the, pretty much anything, there were actually prop getters before hooks in the previous table component library, but it was called get props. So it was more of like a reducer instead of a getter that you would put on something. So you could just go and say, you know what, get the props for every cell, and it would give you the props coming in. You could alter them on their way out.
I see.
And then similarly, you could go in and override the entire component with like a render prop. So there was a render prop for every single core component in the table that you could override. I mean, you know how that gets really messy.
Yeah. Hooks really cleaned up those types of abstractions for sure.
Oh yeah. In fact, I think you did a poll a really long time ago, like right around when React hooks were coming out, and you're like, what's the library with the most public API, like component API? And I was like, I think React Table, I think it took the cake, like I think it won.
There was
Uh,
one date picker from Airbnb that
oh
had
yeah,
like 100 props, including a config prop that was an object with just more options, which is
yeah.
basically just more props.
I had close to that many. It was huge, and now there's only a few options. So
It's amazing. It is
yeah,
so cool because like you were able, most of those things are typically like render related stuff. Like
yeah,
I want to render this, I don't want to render that or whatever.
yeah.
But just say, I'm just not going to do any rendering. Then like it becomes
Yeah.
obvious because it's not even part of the API
And with prop getters, it doesn't mean you can't have any opinion over like props and things that get rendered eventually. Like you can supply people with good starting points with render props, or sorry, with prop getters.
yeah, that's one of the cool things about prop getters and just composition in general. So like you could take all those prop getters. So you have a prop getter for a cell, right? Like, yeah. So you'd say people using React Table, it's really common for them to render a cell. Like it would not make sense for them to render a cell. But with Downshift, we've got use cases. Downshift is an autocomplete, like enhanced input thing. And so you have the menu, you have the input, you have the list items, and it's possible to use Downshift to build like a drop down so you don't have an input. And so like for people who don't care about that, they don't need to
I
say
just don't
don't
render it.
render an input. They just don't
Yeah.
render an input.
Yep.
And then if it were common enough, then what you can do, because the composition is, you'd say, okay, I've got my base hook, and then I have a hook on top of that takes care of the prop getters. And so if
Yep.
people don't care about those prop getters, they just use a basic, like the composition capabilities of this stuff are just mind blowing. And it's all thanks to, I mean, we could do this with render props, but it was not as fun.
Oh, it was
Or,
very messy. Very
yeah,
messy. So
yeah, it's awesome. So that's React Table. What else you've got for us?
after React Table, probably React Query is kind of the next big player in my open source work, which is actually relatively new. React Table has been around for probably almost 4 years now. But React Query has only been around for like 6 to 8 months, I think. So it's
Yeah,
very new.
it's taken on fast in the community.
Yeah.
I think it's grown really quick, and it's because you just solved just an enormous problem. When I first like had my aha moment with React Query, which I think it'd been out like maybe 2 weeks. I tried it pretty early on, I think. But when I had that aha moment with React Query, I was like, oh my gosh, finally! Why did we not have this earlier? And like we should have had this since the beginning. This is the solution. This is it. I honestly, I think that if React Query had been around before Redux, I don't think Redux would have been nearly as popular as it was.
Yeah, I mean that's very kind of you to say too, and I totally agree because just because of the amount of people I see now that are like ditching, not, I hate to say ditching Redux, but they're leaving a majority of their code behind in Redux and moving it to React Query. And it's not just replacing all that code with like a fraction, like a magnitude of the fraction of the code, but it's also doing a lot more than what the existing code in Redux was doing before as well.
Absolutely. Like so there have been other async libraries like React Async, for example,
Right.
that I had used in the past, and like I even contributed a little bit to it. And so that's not what was fundamentally awesome about React Query, and it wasn't even just the hooks aspect, which was really enabling for React Query.
Right.
Like you could have
Kind
done,
of a catalyst, you would say.
yeah. And you could have done a lot of the same stuff without React hooks. It just wouldn't have been quite as nice an API. But you could have done, well, what's really, really critically awesome about React Query is the cache.
Yep.
And that, like, you give me all of the right knobs to turn for controlling that cache. Yeah, it is just so powerful and easy to do the right thing. Like it's there are definitely some things that you could really shoot yourself in the foot over with that. I
Yeah.
mean, caching is a hard problem, but for the most part, I think it's easy to do the right thing.
And
So
a lot of that came down to just researching the defaults that need to be in there. Because I think there are a lot of tools that have all these same knobs, but maybe they don't expose them in a good way, or like you have to configure everything all the time. And with React Query, everything's just kind of set up to be relatively safe to use out of the box, and then gradually, expose more API and stuff to you as you need it.
Yeah. It's just awesome. I'm so glad I have React Query. Like I use it on pretty much anything that I need to make more than a couple requests. So the other day I was working on a little side project, and I didn't even put I didn't even use Create React App for it. It was literally an index HTML. That's the entire app is in there in a script tag.
Oh, I think I saw this tweet.
Yeah. And I used React Query and a couple other things, but like I started with my own use async hook, which I probably should open source. And people who are going through Epic React will see it in a couple of places. Like we build it actually.
I've seen it, and it's awesome. I have something. I think everybody kind of has something similar to that in their application somewhere.
Yeah, I think so too. And so like I copied it over to my little project, and I was using it. And then I was like, why am I doing this? Like, I mean, use async is great for async things that don't need to be cached.
Right, or just one-off requests and stuff.
Right.
In fact, it probably works great as a mutation type.
Exactly. And in fact, I use async in the Bookshelf app in combination with React Query for status updates and stuff like that. It actually works great. Really cool. And people watching this, if they haven't seen that yet, they'll see it and they'll be like, oh, that makes sense. But yeah, I was just blown away by how easy it was to just add React Query, and now I don't have to worry about that anymore. I can focus on this other stuff. And it was just like a small side project, but even in that small side project, React Query made so much sense. And then it's amazing to me how well it scales from like basically the teeniest thing I can imagine to something actually legit that like has customers and stuff.
I'm really glad you said that, because I kind of started from the other end. Nozzle isn't exactly a huge application, but it does have a lot of like different kinds of assets that we're requesting from the server. We've got at least like 10 or 11, CRUD objects that we are requesting. And so it was moderately scaled from the beginning, and to see that it scaled down to like really small solutions and worked great it's great to hear that.
Yeah, dude, it's so awesome. Like, let me just gush over it just a little bit more. So like this little side project, we just have one resource that I'm pulling from a JSON server API, and that's it. And then I have some mutations and things, and actually not even mutations. I have like just network requests that go do a thing. Is that RCP or whatever that?
RPCs.
RPCs. The technical term for that. So I just use mutations for that. It works great. And it just like the stale while revalidate. I'd like you to talk about that a little bit, but that makes it so nice, because when I'm using it on day to day, I use it every day. And whenever there's a change in the back end, I just like open up the window and boom, it gets updated automatically. I don't have to like have a button to refresh or anything like that. It just happens because all the right defaults in there. And that's the other thing. Like when I first started using it, one of the options is to revalidate everything when the user comes back to the window, right? And so I thought, man, I'm actually really surprised that's built in. I feel like that would be something you'd want outside. But honestly, the whole philosophy of React Query is that we embrace the fact that the cache you cannot be confident that the cache is valid. And so we just embrace the staleness of the cache and we revalidate stuff. And if it's the same, then it's like, great. We didn't have to update anything. But Yeah, so like I'd love for you to talk about the philosophy behind not trusting the cache and the stale while revalidate idea.
Yeah. The stale while revalidate like term is actually something that I didn't even know was like a term, like a real thing until after I came out with React Query.
Hmm.
And I learned about that term from the people over at Next and Vercel. And, you know, they have a similar library called SWR, which literally is an acronym for stale while revalidate. And I didn't even know about a lot of this stuff until after I had built it. So I was happy to know that I was, you know, actually
It's very
following that.
validating.
And I'm like, oh, it has a name. That's good, because I want to make sure I was doing it right. But yeah, it definitely started out with that change of assumption. I knew that I needed caching inside of my applications to make them behave quickly and have a good user experience. And really, it all came down to that, having a better user experience. And so, you know, I always talk with my colleagues. I'm like, oh, caching, you know, caching is terrible and it's so hard to do right. And I can't remember one of the discussions that we were having, but I said, well, shouldn't we just assume that everything in a cache is just always out of date, you know? And they said, well, it depends on how expensive it is to revalidate it, right? And I was thinking about that a little more, and I was like, well, it's not that expensive. Like all of our APIs that we interact with, they're getting hit every single time we reload our pages anyway. Like if you hit reload on your browser, you're likely going to hit all of those same APIs again, you know?
Hmm.
And if your website and your API isn't built to withstand people loading it and reloading it, you know, all the time, like then you've got bigger problems. But as long as it is, then we could technically just revalidate all of our assets all the time and make that assumption that you just mentioned, that everything is always out of date or potentially out of date, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you start at that point and work your way forward to, okay, I know more when some assets are not going to be out of date, and you optimize, you opt into those experiences rather than, I think, very dangerously assuming that your cache is perfect and it's always up to date. And you
Mm-hmm.
kind of have to opt into revalidation, which I think is much harder. And
Yeah.
that's kind of what drove the philosophy of React Query, is exactly what you mentioned. Just assume that everything is either always out of date or potentially out of date, and then build an entire API around that experience of, okay, how do we let people opt into keeping data around longer? How do we make it easy to invalidate our data, because we know we're going to have to do that? So what's the easiest path to invalidation? And
Right.
that's what drove the entire public API surface area, which over the last 3 major versions has actually survived pretty well. You know, it's not that different from how it started out.
Yeah. Yeah. It's awesome. And like, if you configure your server cache headers right and everything, then even when I make this request, and if nothing changed, then like the cache will take, like the browser cache will take care of that. You just send a 304. It's nothing changed. And
Yep.
uh, yeah, so I just think that's a brilliant strategy. Well, I had a question about just the other day. I was thinking, what happens if it sends back the same data that it did before, so there's nothing that was actually changed? Do you like do some sort of like do you determine whether components need to be re-rendered, or will they be re-rendered just with the same data?
So it's kind of nice. So we make the assumption you're working with JSON data, which is serializable. So in the first versions of React Query, in fact, even up until just 2 days ago, everything in React Query was just compared with a deep comparison model and said, you know, if anything has changed in this new version, then we're going to replace the entire object. So you can do deep object equality on the entire result. And that worked really well for a really long time to avoid re-renders, right? So if you revalidate a big old list of users, and then the new users come back and they're in the same exact order and they have the same exact properties, then nothing changes and your app doesn't re-render. And then I had an amazing contributor to React Query who has been helping a lot in the last few days. He wrote something that actually uses structural object sharing. And what that means, it's a fancy way to say that we can detect partial changes between the old and the new JSON. So a good example would be if you have a list of users that you're revalidating, and the new result comes back and only one of those users has changed, then what's going to happen is the entire users list reference is going to change, just as it would immutably. You know, old users does not equal new users. However, if you go in and then if you were to go in and compare individual users, so old user 1 to new user 1, they would actually be the same reference still. And then the user that did change would be old user 2 and new user 2 would not equal because it's been changed. So it lets you get really fine grained if you're doing any memoization to say, you know, only memoize something when the user object changes from this big list of users. It's really impressive. And it's something that is just invisibly there. You don't even need to configure it now. We just kind of upgraded it. So
yeah, that's awesome.
As of 2 days ago, that's working.
That's great. Very good. Cool. So one thing that I've had a couple people ask on the Bookshelf app is they'll pull up the terminal and they'll do a profile, and they'll see that or I have a profiler installed, and it actually sends profile data to the back end. And they'll notice that when you load a page that's using React Query, there are actually a lot more re-renders than you expect. So what are those re-renders, and should we be concerned about that?
So some of those re-renders have gone away even in the last few days, as
because of that new change.
Optimizing the core, not only just that change, but just optimizing the reducers that React Query is using under the hood. So some of those have to do with initial data. If you were to provide initial data to a query, you would actually have two renders before, where it would render once without data, and then it would use a layout effect and add the data back in. So you're not necessarily wasting paint time, I guess, kind of a little bit, but those are gone now, and you should see far fewer renders going through React Query now.
That's great.
We even added the ability to, if you really don't want to opt into re-rendering a component because of changes in loading state or data state or something like that, you can actually modify which notifications you want to receive in the component you're using to hook, to get even more fine-grained. But a lot of that has been improved out of the gate. And really the promise that I like to give people with React Query, and now it's more true than it was yesterday, is that the component will never re-render unless something has changed in the state that you rely on in your component. So loading state is fetching in the background, data changing. Those are the only things that should be causing re-renders in React Query.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, I figured with the latest changes, that's very true.
Yeah. I figured that things would improve, and like that's what's kind of nice about a library that's depended on by a lot of people, is lots of smart people come into this thing and just make it awesome. Even, you know, so you made it work or made it work, make it right, make it fast. And so we're still in that process of making it fast. And so it's awesome.
Yeah. What's great is that even without those optimizations, it still was fast enough, you know?
Yeah.
I don't feel like anybody, I've spoken with a lot of big companies who are using it, and they have never mentioned anything about performance. In fact, I have someone who internally is they're already using it at Walmart quite a bit. And he did speed tests, performance testing between, you know, Redux and React Query and all of the other options. And they actually chose React Query because it had faster load times and invalidation times.
Wow.
So, And when I learned about some of these, performance optimizations to be made, I was like, wow, I'm surprised it still even passed the test. So
Yeah, that's fantastic. Hey, do you know about the experimental use mutable source hook that React is
yeah,
working on?
yeah, I've looked into it a little bit. I was tempted to like, oh, I got to try this out right now, but that never really works out in my favor. So I've just been waiting for it to come out. But yeah, like I am excited about that to where we're not going to have to use kind of this pub sub model anymore.
So
Even though
you do
the
see
pub sub
potential.
model really is not that bad. Let's be honest. It's not that bad. Um, and like Zestand is another library that I actually really adore. I've only been using it for like a week, but for some reason it just spoke to me.
Hmm.
But they're using the same type of pub sub model,
Hmm.
and it'll be cool to see how use mutable source kind of gets rid of that and brings things back into the React, like the React way,
Hmm.
of doing things. Um, I'm still curious whether it's going to make a huge performance impact. I feel like it's going to be more about being concurrent mode safe than actually being faster, in my opinion. But I guess that's kind of the same thing, though.
Yeah, that makes sense. Um, cool. So I wanted to also ask you about like that React way, and I know that people who are really into Redux or MobX are they really like the fact that you can put all of your business logic into this JavaScript only stuff, and then just like this tiny little bridge to get you over to React land. And there's just something that gets people excited about that. Whereas with React Query, you're pretty much using hooks left, right, and center. Like you can't separate your stuff. I mean, you can make functions that go get your data and transform your data or whatever, but like at the end of the day, you've got to hook this up to your own hooks, no pun intended. What are your thoughts about that, like coupling your source code to React?
I don't know. From my perspective, how often are we changing frameworks? You know, um, I used Angular for years, and I built amazing projects with it,
Yeah, and when
and you
when you
did too.
changed from Angular to React, how much of that code were you able, like, would you have even wanted to port over, just copy paste?
No, like we copied over concepts, and if we had types at the time, we would have brought over some types for some of the structures that we were still going to use. But I don't feel like we would have brought over much code, just because between frameworks, it's not just logic that's changing. Usually paradigms are changing, and seeing how React is living even longer than my Angular bout was, I feel like the concern of changing frameworks and being framework agnostic with your logic is slowly going away. At least for me. And with that perspective, I say, why not just embrace whatever framework you're using? And as soon as you let go of all of that, I think you gain a lot more productivity, and in a good way, the ability to abstract away a lot of this logic that you would have to do on your own. If you owned all the business logic here and you've got your framework here, I still feel like that's kind of forcing, a square peg into a round hole. Like just putting them together feels so much better. That's why I built React Query. I say just go all in. If
Yeah.
we're going to use hooks, let's take advantage of them to the fullest extent.
Yeah, that's kind of my perspective as well. Like, even if we decided to switch over to Vue, how much of that stuff would we want to carry over? Because I am on the same page with you that the paradigms change. Like even
Yeah.
when you come back around to it, like okay, maybe if you're migrating over time, which is what you'd probably want to do anyway, like having this logic be separate so it can communicate with both of them, I can see how that could be valuable. But yeah, I'm much of the opinion that if you're going to do React, just go all in and
Yep.
and bet on it. And I mean, like it's been around long enough that you're not going to make a wrong bet. Like the computers will write your app for you before React is not useful anymore. So
Yeah.
yeah. So I wanted to talk really quickly about the React Virtual too, because we do use that in the performance workshop. Yeah, just like, where did the inspiration for React Virtual? Because there's React Window, React Virtualize, both by Brian, who's a brilliant, smart engineer at Facebook. Why did you feel like React Virtual needed to exist?
Well, I love Brian and I love those two libraries, and I use them extensively still in some of my projects that I haven't migrated over. One of the reasons is I wanted a hook-centric approach to virtualization, and I feel like the existing libraries in the ecosystem hadn't yet really embraced hooks fully. They still relied on rendering components or passing some type of rigid render prop or component that usually ended up causing me problems with having to memoize components or like use memo a component. And I don't like doing that. I would rather memoize the CPU and the work that goes behind all these things and just be free to render how I want. So that was the first, that was kind of the challenge that opened it up for me. And the inspiration absolutely came from the prior work in the ecosystem. All of Brian's work was very valuable to go and study and learn exactly how the virtualization was working. Once you wrap your head around it, it's still difficult to understand. But I'll just say that. Like, I still, like, you're like, oh, how does React Virtual work? Like, I would have to go back and look at my code to remember what I'm doing, right? But I wanted to keep it really small, really easy to understand, just, so that anybody could come in and contribute and make it better. And I feel like it does that without sacrificing too much. Now, obviously, it doesn't have all the bells and whistles that you would need for building, really intense data grid, syncing and all that stuff. Maybe it will someday, but for now, it's doing a fantastic job at just, oh, I need to virtualize this list and I want to have 100% control over my rendering. I'm going to use React Virtual.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you that when I switched from React Window to React Virtual in the performance workshop, part of the reason that I did that was because I was also switching from the downshift render prop component to the downshift use combo box hook, which actually I didn't write that one. It was I did contribute a little bit to it thanks to working on it, but on the upgrading this performance exercise. But yeah, so when I was moving everything over, I was like, let's just go full sail onto hooks. And the before and after of that was like render props and other components. And oh, like you have to pass this component as a children prop. It's kind of weird, and you have to memorize a bunch of stuff. And I switched over to hooks, and it was like, wow, this is amazing. Like everything's so flat over onto the left and straightforward. The one drawback was that I had to now think about applying styles myself, where React Window took care of that for me. That was kind of nice. And I remember, I think I opened an issue asking you to give me a prop getter for that or something. And you pushed back, and it was good. It was good. We ended up with something pretty good. But that's a cool thing about these abstractions as a hook, is that like if it really mattered to me, I could just make my own hook around this, and my own hook can do that.
Yep.
So it's powerful stuff.
Yeah, that definitely gets difficult when it comes to styles. When it came to React Virtual, you're really just translating a lot of kind of these measurements and math into styles. And unfortunately, there's like 2 or 3 different ways of doing virtualization with, like, it's when it comes to CSS, right? Like you can do transforms, or you can do absolutely positioned elements. You can even do a CSS grid where every single cell or row lives in the same grid item. Like
wow,
which has great performance benefits. Actually, they all have their different use cases, and that was kind of the primary driver for not making an assumption there and just saying, here's the math, and then here's some common patterns around it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I can tell you, I used React Virtual as well for this little side project because I had a big list of things, and my desktop was able to handle it fine, but I use my phone most of the time with this app, and I wanted to virtualize this list, and this was the first time I tried to do any virtualization with dynamically sized elements. So I bumped into a little problem, but you helped me out, figure that out. My problem was not reading the docs, basically. But yeah, I was really surprised how easy it was to get that dynamic list going as well. Like, yeah, it's amazing. Good job on that one.
The dynamic stuff is so confusing. It's really hard. In fact, I feel like the hardest stuff I've done with some of my libraries has been around like dynamic measuring for applications. I'm kind of going through the same rough patches with dynamic measuring with my charting library, React Charts, which has a lot of like automatic dynamic calculation of placement of all these divs and SVGs to kind of like fit everything together. And I've been working on it for the last 4 days, and I really just want to give up, but I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep going.
Yeah. Well, so Tanner, you've got GitHub sponsors. That's kind of your main source of income from the open source side of things. Is that in addition to the React Query Essentials, right? You want to talk about some of those things? Like, how can people support you with this stuff?
Yeah. So GitHub sponsors is a great way. Every single person who sponsors can get their name and a link. And if you sponsor high enough, I even let you put like a logo or really whatever you want, like on my websites and stuff. Like it's kind of like advertising, but I don't like to call it that, right? but people can do that. And I even have enterprise companies who sponsor me that are not allowed to put their logo on my website for legal reasons, but they just do it for.
Wow, that's good for them. That's great.
And and I make sure that all my sponsors are well taken care of. And I'm not making promises on like office hours or anything, but I make sure that everybody's happy. React Query Essentials was something new for me. I know you've been doing courses for a while, at least relatively from my perspective. And I'm sure everybody watching this is gonna, love this course and everything. I went out on a limb and decided to create my own first course called React Query Essentials, which goes really in depth just on React Query. Basically goes over every single part of the API and took everything out of my brain and put it into a big video course similar to what you're watching right now. So.
Yeah, that's great. So I watched several of those videos. I haven't gotten through it all yet, but if people watching, if the React Query stuff that I show you, which is quite a few videos, but if it certainly doesn't cover all of the API, just what we need for the app that we're building. And if that's not deep enough for you and the docs aren't doing it for you, then definitely give React Query Essentials a look. Because it'll give you all the things. And Tanner, you also have the TanStack Discord. Do you want to invite people to that?
Yeah, absolutely. You can just go to tanstack.com and there's a link there that you can join the Discord. Just basically talking about all things TanStack. So React Query, Table, Charts, even React Virtual, they all have dedicated channels and people who are asking questions and helping each other solve problems around all of those libraries.
Great. Cool, man. Well, thanks so much for giving me some of your time and looking forward to people watching this and tweeting at you. What is your Twitter handle?
Tanner Lindsley, just my name.
Awesome. Then, yeah, tweet at Tanner, tell him how awesome he is, how much you love the TanStack. And yeah, we'll see y'all later.
Thanks.